The afternoon sun was bright when passengers began boarding Flight 722 to Los Angeles. The air inside the airport smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, and the soft announcements echoed off the tall glass walls. People stood in lines that moved slowly toward the gate, each carrying their own stories, their own reasons for travel. Some were on vacation, some on business trips, and some just wanted to get home. Among them was a quiet man who didn't draw much attention. He wore a plain jacket, carried one small bag, and kept his head slightly down as he moved forward. When the flight attendant scanned his ticket, she gave him a polite smile and pointed him toward the middle of the plane. He nodded and walked down the aisle until he reached his seat, 20D. He slid his bag into the overhead bin, sat down, and fastened his seatbelt. The hum of passengers finding their seats surrounded him, children talking, zippers opening, people asking politely to squeeze past. He took a slow breath, looked out the small oval window, and for a moment his reflection stared back at him. He looked tired but calm, like someone who had been through a lot yet carried it quietly. A woman sat down next to him in 20E. She seemed cheerful, maybe in her mid-30s, the kind of person who always smiled easily. She placed her book in the seat pocket and turned toward him. "You traveling for work or heading home?" she asked with a friendly tone. He looked at her, smiled politely, and said, "Just heading home." His voice was calm and low, the kind that didn't say much but still sounded kind. "That's always the best reason to fly," she replied. "Nothing beats going home." He nodded but didn't add more. He wasn't being rude, just quiet. The woman sensed it and decided not to press further. She put on her headphones, and soon the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. As the plane started to move, the engines roared softly, and the vibration spread through the seats. The man looked down, watching his hands resting on his knees. His fingers were calloused, and there was a small scar on one of them, the kind of mark that holds stories nobody talks about. When the plane lifted off the ground, he leaned back and closed his eyes. For most people, takeoff was a moment of excitement or fear. For him, it was just noise, familiar, predictable, almost comforting. The sky outside turned golden as the plane climbed above the clouds, and the city below faded into a blur. After about an hour, the flight settled into calmness. The seatbelt signs went off and people started relaxing. Some opened laptops, others ordered drinks. The man in 20D stayed quiet. He took out a small, worn-out notebook from his jacket pocket and flipped it open. Inside were short notes, coordinates, and a few hand-drawn sketches. None of them made much sense to anyone but him. The woman beside him glanced at the notebook but quickly looked away, realizing it was personal. She smiled again and said, "You write a lot?" He looked up and said softly, "Just reminders." "Work stuff?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Something like that." The flight attendant came by with a cart offering drinks. He asked for just water. When she handed it to him, she noticed a small metal bracelet on his wrist. It looked old but sturdy, with faded letters engraved on it, almost like a tag. She didn't ask about it, but something about it caught her attention. Hours passed quietly. The passengers around him talked about movies, work, and plans after landing. The woman next to him began watching something on her tablet, laughing softly at scenes only she could see. But the man's mind was elsewhere. Every once in a while he would glance out the window and then back at his notebook, as if checking something only he could understand. He wasn't nervous, just alert, the way someone stays when they've been trained never to let their guard down completely. Halfway through the flight, the captain's voice came over the speaker. It was calm, professional, the way all pilots sound when talking to a cabin full of strangers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Weather ahead looks smooth and we're expecting to land right on time. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The man in 20D leaned his head against the seat. The woman smiled. "At least no delays," she said lightly. He gave a small nod, his eyes still fixed on the seat ahead. "Yeah, that's good." But deep down there was a weight behind his calmness. He wasn't just another passenger heading home. He had seen things, moments of chaos and courage that left marks inside him. The world saw him as ordinary, but his silence carried stories of people saved, of nights spent under uncertain skies, of promises kept without ever being spoken aloud. He took another sip of water and stared at the bracelet on his wrist. The letters were almost unreadable now, but he remembered exactly what they said. It wasn't jewelry. It was a call sign, a code that once represented who he was and what he did. He hadn't heard it in months, and he hoped he never would again. The flight continued peacefully. The crew dimmed the lights as the sky outside darkened. A few passengers were already asleep, heads leaning against the windows. The soft hum of the engines filled the air like white noise. The woman next to him whispered, "You fly often?" He looked over and said, "Used to." "Used to?" she asked curiously. He nodded. "Different kind of flights, though," she smiled. "Pilot?" He gave a small laugh, the first real one since takeoff. Not quite. Something like that. She didn't push further. Something in his tone told her there was more behind those words, but also that it wasn't something to be asked about. They both went quiet again, listening to the steady rhythm of the plane. Time passed. The seatbelt signs flickered on again as the captain announced some light turbulence ahead. The plane shook slightly and a few passengers gasped. The man in 20D didn't even flinch. His hand stayed steady on the armrest, eyes focused. It wasn't fear, it was instinct. When the turbulence ended, the woman next to him chuckled nervously. "I hate that feeling," she said. He nodded. "You get used to it." The words slipped out naturally, but they carried more meaning than she realized. For him, turbulence wasn't about air pockets or shaking wings. It was about surviving real storms, ones that had nothing to do with weather. As the hours went by, the cabin lights dimmed further. The flight attendants moved quietly between rows, checking on passengers. Somewhere near the front, a baby cried softly before being hushed back to sleep. It was peaceful again, almost too quiet. The man in 20D closed his notebook and placed it back in his pocket. His mind drifted to memories he tried not to replay. Faces, sounds, calls over radios, the kind of moments that come back when the world finally goes silent. He took a deep breath and looked out at the endless dark sky. It felt good to just be another person for once, sitting in a regular seat with no expectations, no orders, no mission. He didn't notice the flight attendant walking by at first. She stopped near his row, smiled gently, and asked if everything was okay. He nodded and said yes, appreciating the small act of kindness. People often overlooked such moments, but to him, they meant more than they seemed. After a while, the captain's voice came back on, but this time it sounded slightly different. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've just received a quick update from air traffic control. Nothing to worry about, just a standard communication check." The man in 20D's eyes shifted slightly. He looked toward the front of the plane, a hint of alertness returning to his face. The captain continued, mentioning something about flight clearance, and then said a short series of letters and numbers, almost like a code. The passengers didn't think much of it, but the man in 20D froze for half a second. That combination of words on that call sign wasn't random. It wasn't meant for regular passengers. It was something he hadn't heard since his last assignment, something connected to him in a way nobody on that plane could understand. He didn't react outwardly, but inside, his heartbeat picked up. The woman beside him didn't notice anything different. She smiled sleepily and leaned back into her seat. He turned his face toward the window, hiding the flicker of realization in his eyes. Somewhere, somehow, that call sign had been said over the radio again. The one that used to define him, the one he thought was retired for good. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly. Inside, the quiet hum of the engines continued as if nothing had changed. But for the man in seat 20D, something had. He sat there still and silent as the rest of the passengers drifted into dreams. Only he knew that a single call sign, spoken aloud by chance, had just reached the one person on that plane who could never ignore it. And though no one else realized it yet, that single moment had just turned an ordinary flight into something unforgettable. The night sky outside the airplane window was dark and endless, dotted with tiny white lights that looked like stars resting on soft black velvet. Inside, the cabin was quiet except for the low hum of the engines and the occasional soft cough or the rustle of a blanket. Most passengers were asleep now, their faces relaxed, their bodies gently leaning with the movement of the plane. But the man in Seat 20D was wide awake. His eyes were fixed on the window, though he wasn't really looking at the view anymore. He was thinking about the words he had just heard, that short coded call sign the captain had said so casually. To everyone else, it was just a random string of numbers and letters, but to him, it was something that once meant everything. He leaned back and closed his eyes, as if trying to convince himself it didn't mean anything now. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he heard it wrong. But deep down, he knew better. That call sign wasn't just a coincidence. It was his. Or at least it used to be. It had been years since he last responded to it. Back then, he was in a different world. One filled with radio chatter, coded messages, and long nights waiting for orders that could come at any minute. That call sign had once been his name, his identity, the sound that could pull him out of sleep and send him into action. Hearing it now here on a quiet passenger flight felt like hearing an old ghost whisper his name. He rubbed his face slowly, trying to calm the sudden rush of thoughts. The woman beside him stirred a little, stretching her arms before looking over. "You okay?" she asked softly, half asleep. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just can't sleep. Too much coffee?" She teased. He smiled faintly. "Something like that." She smiled back, then turned away, pulling her blanket tighter and drifting off again. He waited until her breathing evened out before glancing down the aisle. Everything looked normal. The cabin crew was quietly checking seatbelts and closing overhead bins. There was no sign of anything unusual. Still, the uneasy feeling in his chest didn't fade. He reached for his jacket pocket and took out his notebook again. He flipped through the pages until he found a section filled with short coded notes, coordinates, symbols, and fragments of old radio messages. Near the bottom of one page, he had written that same call sign years ago. He stared at it for a long time, tracing his finger over the faded ink. He had thought he left that part of his life behind. The missions, the secrecy, the danger, and all of it. When he decided to return home, he told himself that chapter was closed for good. But now, hearing that call sign again, it felt like the past had just reached out and tapped him on the shoulder. He looked up when a flight attendant passed by. She gave him a polite smile. "Everything all right, sir?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "All good." She nodded and moved on, but something about her expression made him wonder. Did she know something? Or was he just imagining it? He turned his head toward the front of the plane, trying to see the cockpit door. It was closed, as always, but the small green light above it showed that the crew was still communicating. He noticed another flight attendant walking briskly toward the front, whispering something to a colleague before picking up the cabin phone. It could have been anything. A passenger issue, a food request, or routine communication, but his instincts told him otherwise. He had lived too long in a world where small things meant big signals. A single whispered word, a quick look, a piece of radio chatter. They all carried meaning if you knew how to read them. The plane hit a light patch of turbulence, shaking gently. Passengers shifted in their seats but didn't wake up. The man in 20D barely moved. He'd flown through worse, much worse. The shaking didn't bother him, but the unknown did. He thought about why that call sign would have been said over a public channel. It wasn't standard. It wasn't even used anymore. Someone either made a mistake or wanted to get his attention, and if it was the second reason, it meant someone on that plane knew exactly who he was. He took a deep breath and told himself to stay calm. Whatever it was, panicking wouldn't help. He reminded himself that he wasn't on duty anymore, that this was just a commercial flight full of ordinary people. He looked around again. A young couple asleep with their heads together, a man snoring softly near the window, a teenage boy playing a game quietly on his phone. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, from the front of the cabin, the intercom clicked on again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, his tone still calm but with a slight edge of hesitation. "If there's a passenger in seat 20D, please remain seated. A member of our crew will be with you shortly." Every head that was awake turned toward the middle of the plane. The man froze. His body went completely still, but his mind was racing. Why him? Why seat 20D? The woman next to him blinked in confusion. "That's you," she whispered. He nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. The flight attendant who had spoken to him earlier was already walking toward him. Her expression was composed but serious. She stopped beside his seat and spoke quietly so others couldn't hear. "Sir, the captain would like to confirm something with you. May I ask, do you recognize the call sign that was mentioned earlier?" He looked at her for a moment, saying nothing. Then he asked softly, "Why do you ask?" She hesitated. "Because it wasn't supposed to go over the public channel. It was a secure code. It seems someone sent it directly to our cockpit." His chest tightened. That meant someone had intentionally reached out, and not by accident. "Who sent it?" he asked. "We don't know yet," she said. "But the message came from a control center that only handles special communications." He took a slow breath, then nodded. "Tell the captain I heard it, and tell him I'm listening." The attendant gave a small nod before walking back up the aisle. The woman beside him stared at him in disbelief. "What's going on?" she whispered. He gave a faint smile. "Probably nothing. Just a mix-up." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. His tone didn't fool her either, but she didn't push further. The curiosity in her eyes was clear, but she respected his space. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. The plane continued smoothly through the night sky, but there was a quiet tension in the air now. Passengers were awake, whispering softly, wondering what was happening. Some thought it might be a medical issue or a security concern. No one imagined it had anything to do with a single man in the middle of the plane. Then the intercom clicked again. This time the captain's voice was softer, almost personal. "To the passenger in seat 20D, you have a message waiting at our destination. Please identify yourself to the crew upon landing." He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of those words. That was not a normal airline message. It was direct, coded, and meant only for him. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, but his mind was full of questions. Who sent it? Why now? The woman beside him whispered, "You're someone important, aren't you?" He smiled lightly, shaking his head. "Not important. Just someone who used to do a different kind of work." She tilted her head. "Military?" He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. The rest of the flight carried on quietly, but everyone could feel that something was different. The flight attendants moved more carefully, and the captain made no more announcements. Even the air felt heavier, like the plane itself knew it was carrying a secret. As the hours went by, he sat quietly, thinking. Maybe it was a message from someone he once worked with. Maybe it was a call for help. Or maybe it was just a signal. A reminder that no matter how far he traveled, his past would always find him. He watched as dawn began to break outside the window, painting the clouds in soft shades of orange and pink. The world below was still sleeping, unaware of the silent story unfolding at 30,000 feet. When the captain finally announced the descent, passengers began to stir, stretching and yawning. The woman beside him smiled, though curiosity still glowed in her eyes. "Well," she said softly, "I guess you're about to get your answers." He gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe." As the plane lowered toward the city, the seatbelt signs came on again. The world outside grew clearer. Highways, rooftops, and morning light spreading across the horizon. Everything looked normal, yet nothing felt normal anymore. The man in 20D sat up straight, ready for landing. The engines roared, the wheels touched down, and a wave of applause rippled through the cabin. But he didn't join in. His eyes were on the door at the front of the plane. He knew that once it opened, his quiet flight home would no longer be just another trip. He didn't know yet what waited for him beyond that door, only that a single call sign had already changed everything. The plane slowed down, the tires squealing lightly against the runway before coming to a gentle roll. The passengers clapped softly, a few cheering under their breath, happy to have landed safely. The sunlight poured in through the windows now, golden and warm, lighting up the faces of sleepy travelers. To most, it was the end of a routine flight. To the man in seat 20D, it felt like the beginning of something he hadn't expected to face again. He stayed seated as the plane taxied toward the gate. People around him started unbuckling their belts, stretching and reaching for their bags. The woman beside him smiled and said, "Well, we made it." He nodded, smiling faintly. "Yeah, we did." She leaned in a little. "So you gonna tell me what that was all about?" she asked quietly. He looked down for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "I wish I could," he said softly. "But even I don't fully know yet." Her eyes softened. She could tell he meant it. There was no arrogance or mystery in his tone, just honesty. She didn't press any further. When the plane came to a stop, the captain spoke again through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. For your safety, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. To our special passenger in seat 20D, please remain seated for a moment after others have exited." That caught everyone's attention. Heads turned subtly, glances shifted toward him. He could feel their curiosity pressing against him like invisible waves. He didn't move, didn't react. He simply looked down at his hands and waited. The woman beside him whispered, Guess that means you're not leaving with the rest of us. He chuckled quietly. Guess not. When the seatbelt sign went off, the cabin filled with the usual noise of people gathering their belongings. Bags came down from overhead bins, phones turned on, jackets were pulled out. The aisles filled with passengers eager to stretch their legs and step back into their normal lives. He stayed seated, watching as each row emptied, one by one. The woman gave him a warm smile before leaving. Whatever this is, she said softly, I hope it's good news. Thank you, he said. Me too. Soon only a few passengers remained, and then finally the last one stepped off. The flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin, checking for forgotten items. One of them approached him, the same woman who had spoken to him mid-flight. Sir, she said gently. The captain asked if you could come forward. He nodded, unbuckled his belt, and stood up. The cabin felt strangely still now, empty except for the soft hum of the air system. He picked up his small bag from the overhead bin and followed her toward the cockpit. When they reached the front, the captain was standing just outside the cockpit door, waiting. He was a tall man with a calm face, though his eyes looked slightly tense like someone who had just been told something important. Thank you for waiting, the captain said quietly. We received a message while we were in the air. It was coded, but my co-pilot recognized the format. It was addressed directly to your old call sign. The man in 20D nodded slowly. Do you know who sent it? The captain shook his head. No name. Just a relay from a control channel marked as confidential. It requested that you be informed upon landing and that ground coordination would be waiting. The man took a deep breath. He had been out of that world long enough to know that when messages like that showed up, it wasn't casual. It meant something had gone wrong, or something needed fixing. Either way, it meant being pulled back in. The captain continued. I can't tell you much more, but there's an officer waiting near the gate who asked to speak with you privately. Thank you, he said quietly. The captain nodded respectfully. You served well, didn't you? The man hesitated. A long time ago. Well, the captain said, extending his hand. Welcome home. Either way. He shook the captain's hand firmly and gave a faint smile before stepping off the plane. As he walked through the narrow tunnel connecting the aircraft to the terminal, he felt a strange mix of calm and unease. The world outside was bright and full of movement, but in his mind everything felt suspended, like he was walking between two different lives. The quiet civilian one he had built, and the one that had never really let him go. When he stepped into the terminal, people rushed past in every direction, families greeting loved ones, travelers dragging luggage, children running ahead of their parents. Amid the noise and chaos, a man in a simple dark suit stood near the gate waiting. He wasn't holding a sign, but the way he stood, still, observant, scanning the crowd, made it clear who he was there for. Their eyes met, and for a second, time seemed to pause. The man in 20D walked over slowly. The one in the suit nodded in acknowledgement. Good to see you, the suited man said quietly. It's been a while, the traveler nodded. Too long. I'm sorry we had to reach you like that, the suited man continued. There wasn't another secure way. That call sign? The traveler said, You know what it means to hear it again. I do, the man replied. But we didn't have much choice. Something came up. Something only you can help with, the traveler sighed. I'm not in that world anymore. The man in the suit looked at him steadily. Maybe not. But the world isn't done with you yet. For a moment, they both stood silently as passengers walked by, dragging bags, talking on phones, completely unaware of the quiet exchange happening just a few feet away. Finally, the man in the suit said, Let's step somewhere private. We shouldn't talk here. They walked toward a quieter part of the terminal, away from the noise and crowd. The traveler moved with the same calm, measured steps he always had. Years of discipline had taught him how to control everything, his movements, his breathing, his words. But inside he could feel the unease growing. He had promised himself that part of his life was behind him. They stopped near a corner, by a row of empty chairs facing the large glass windows overlooking the runway. Planes came and went, their lights flickering against the sky. The man in the suit spoke first. The message came from an old contact, someone who worked closely with you. They didn't use their name, but the way it was sent, it matches your old protocol. The traveler frowned. Old contact? You mean, yes, The man in the suit interrupted softly. Someone who was on your last mission? That hit harder than expected. He hadn't thought about that mission in years. He had buried it deep along with everything that came with it. I thought everyone was accounted for, he said quietly. So did we, the man replied. Until yesterday. The traveler looked away, watching a plane take off in the distance. The engines roared softly, fading into the horizon. What do they want from me? He asked finally. Information, the man in the suit said. They need confirmation, a code that only you can verify. Without it, they can't complete the retrieval. He shook his head. I don't have access anymore. I left that behind. I know, the man replied. But they don't. They still trust your call sign. You're the only one they'll listen to. He stood there in silence for a long time, the weight of old memories pressing down on him. Faces he hadn't seen in years flashed in his mind. Friends, teammates, moments of trust and danger. He had lost more than he could count, and he wasn't sure he could face it again. Finally, he said quietly, If I do this, it ends after that. No more messages. No more call signs. The man in the suit nodded. Understood. Then tell me what I need to do. The man in the suit handed him a small sealed envelope. Inside there's a secure line and an access code. Once you confirm your identity, they'll contact you. After that, you'll decide how far you want to go. He took the envelope and looked at it for a moment. It was light, just a single folded paper inside, but it felt heavier than anything he'd held in years. The man in the suit gave him one last nod before stepping away. It's good to see you again, he said. You were always the one who could handle the impossible. The traveler didn't respond. He just watched him walk away until he disappeared into the crowd. He stood there, staring at the envelope in his hand. The sunlight outside the window reflected off it, and for a moment it almost looked like it was glowing. He thought about the quiet life he had been living, the peace he had found, and now all of it was being pulled back toward a world he thought was gone. He slipped the envelope into his pocket, picked up his bag, and started walking toward the exit. Every step felt heavier than the last. People brushed past him, laughing, talking, living ordinary lives. None of them knew that one quiet passenger from seat 20D had just been called back into a story that wasn't finished yet. As he stepped outside into the cool morning air, he paused for a moment and looked at the rising sun. A new day had begun, but for him, it was the return of an old shadow. The morning air was crisp as he stepped out of the terminal into the airport's arrival area. Sunlight spilled across the tarmac, casting long shadows from the planes parked nearby. The noise of rolling suitcases, distant engines, and passengers calling out to each other filled the air. But he moved through it all quietly, almost invisible. It had been a long flight, one that should have been ordinary, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the small envelope in his jacket pocket. Inside were instructions, codes, and contact details, all that he needed to reconnect with a world he had left behind. He had promised himself that chapter of life was closed, that he would no longer be pulled back into missions, radio codes, and the constant pressure of being someone's last hope. Yet here he was, standing in a busy airport, aware that one short call sign had already changed the course of his day. A taxi pulled up nearby and the driver gave a friendly wave. He waved back without a word and got in. The city blurred past him as the taxi wound through morning traffic. Skyscrapers gleamed in the early sunlight, streets filled with commuters, and the normal hum of life seemed peaceful compared to the tension he felt inside. He couldn't help but replay the flight in his mind. That simple ordinary seat, 20D, had suddenly felt like the center of attention. Normally, he would have remained invisible. On a plane, no one paid him more than a passing glance. But today, a single message had thrown everything into sharp relief. Even the flight attendants, who were usually polite but detached, had been alert the moment the call sign was transmitted. The taxi stopped in front of a small, unassuming building near the edge of the airport. It wasn't official looking. There was no flashing sign, no indication of importance. Just a plain door and a few parked cars. He stepped out, handed a folded bill to the driver, and moved toward the entrance. Inside, the air was cool, and the space was quiet except for the soft hum of air conditioning. A single man in a suit approached, holding a tablet and a notebook. His movements were precise, calm, and professional. the kind of presence that immediately signaled he was not someone ordinary. "Good morning," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm glad you came." He shook the hand firmly but said nothing. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the small office, the chairs neatly arranged, the files stacked in an orderly fashion. Everything was simple, but everything was purposeful. "Have a seat," the man said. He gestured toward a chair opposite a small table. The traveler sat slowly, careful not to fidget even though a part of him felt restless. "First," the suited man began, "thank you for responding. We know you've been out of the field for a long time, but the situation requires someone with your expertise." He nodded, though inwardly he wanted to resist. "I'm not in that world anymore," he said softly. "I understand," the man replied. "And you don't have to stay if you don't want to. But you can't ignore this either. The call sign you heard was no mistake. It was meant for you, and it was urgent." He leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "I promised myself that chapter was closed. I wanted normal. I wanted quiet." The suited man nodded knowingly. "Everyone deserves peace. But sometimes peace doesn't come until the right moment, and this moment has found you." He remained silent for a long time, considering. The last mission he had participated in had cost too much. People he had trusted, teammates he had relied on, lives lost that he could not forget. The weight of all that responsibility had followed him home, even into ordinary days. He had hoped that living quietly would be enough to leave it behind. "You can do this," the suited man said gently. "No one else can. Not the new recruits, not the teams in training, not anyone. Only you have the experience and the call sign they trust. They're asking for guidance. Just guidance, not action. You decide how far you go." He looked at the envelope in his jacket pocket. It felt heavier now, not just because of its contents, but because of what it represented. A bridge between the life he thought he left behind and the quiet life he had built. Finally, he spoke. "Show me." The man in the suit handed him the tablet. On the screen was a list of coordinates, a series of encrypted messages, and a set of instructions. One particular line caught his eye immediately. It was the same call sign from the flight, repeated with a timestamp and a small note. "Verification needed." He frowned. "So they need confirmation that it's really me?" "Yes," the suited man said. "They won't proceed without it. You're the only one who can verify the call sign, even after all these years. That's why it was sent directly to the cockpit. That's why it reached you." He took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's do this." The man in the suit watched him closely, then stepped back to give him space. "I'll handle communications here. You just need to provide the verification when prompted." He opened the envelope and followed the instructions carefully. Every step required precision, entering codes, confirming details, and waiting for a secure response. It felt strange, like stepping back into a world that had been paused, frozen until now. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. His heartbeat was steady, controlled, but the adrenaline of recognition coursed beneath the surface. Every detail mattered. One mistake could compromise the message, the verification, and everything dependent on it. Then the tablet pinged. A message appeared asking him to enter the call sign. He typed it slowly, deliberately, each letter and number coming alive as if it were a word spoken out loud for the first time in years. The screen blinked. Confirmation received. Verification accepted. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. A weight lifted slightly, though he knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere, someone on the other end now knew it was him, that the call sign belonged to the person they had once relied on, the person they trusted implicitly. The suited man gave a small smile. "It worked. You did it. You're recognized, confirmed, and acknowledged. That's all they need for now. You can stop any time after this point." He nodded again, closing his eyes for a moment. It's strange. Just a few letters, a simple call sign, and suddenly, everything feels alive again. Like the past is right here. "That's the power of what you did," the man replied. "The call sign isn't just a name. It's trust, experience, and responsibility. It's respect that can't be replaced." He opened his eyes and looked around the quiet office. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a single man had just stepped back into a story that mattered far more than anyone outside could imagine. The weight of recognition was both heavy and oddly comforting. For a moment he allowed himself to feel it, the acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, still relied on him. The suited man continued. There's something else. The network will reach out soon, but for now they've asked that you wait. The first step was confirmation. You did it. That's enough for today. He nodded. I needed that, he admitted. Even just to know that the world hasn't forgotten completely. The man in the suit placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. You've never been forgotten. And now others will see what Seat 20D has always known. That courage can exist quietly, without anyone noticing until it matters the most. Outside the window, the morning sun climbed higher, shining on the city streets below. He felt a strange mix of relief and tension. The call sign had been acknowledged, his presence verified, but the story was not over. It never truly ends for someone who has carried it. He picked up his bag, placed the envelope back in his jacket, and stood. He knew that soon, more people would know what he had done, what he represented. For now, though, it was enough to have a small moment of quiet triumph, to feel the significance of being recognized without fanfare. As he walked toward the exit, he realized something important. Sometimes recognition doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it comes with a simple acknowledgement, a word, a signal, a call sign that reminds the world that even quiet courage can shine brightly when it needs to. He pushed open the door to the street and stepped into the sunlight. Carrying the weight of the past and the knowledge that a small action, a brief acknowledgement, could turn an ordinary day into something unforgettable.